One week before Christmas, I came home after several days of medical tests and found my key no longer fit the lock. My son opened the door just enough to look at me and said coldly, "My wife is pregnant, and she doesn't feel comfortable seeing you anymore. Your things are in that trash bag. Just leave." That freezing night, I took shelter in a church warming center. When I quietly told an elderly woman my name, she froze, slipped an old brass key into my hand, and whispered, "So, it really is you. Your wife knew this day would come. I am so grateful you chose to spend this time with me tonight. Tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? That one line from you keeps this channel going more than you know." If Dad's Revenge Stories has ever given you something worth keeping, hit subscribe and bring a friend along. Some elements of this story are fictional, added for depth and purpose. Resemblance to real people or places is coincidental. The message, however, is one I hope you carry with you. My name is Walter Dillon, and I am 65 years old. I spent 35 years of my life reading wiring diagrams, tracing circuits through walls, and teaching electricity to behave itself. I know how things connect. I know how they break. And I know better than most that the moment something stops working is rarely the moment it actually failed. The failure happened earlier, quietly, in a place nobody thought to check. I want you to remember that. Because this story is about a failure that had been building for years before the night I came home and found my own front door locked against me. It was December 18th, a Tuesday, 1 week before Christmas. I had been at the Glendale Medical Center for 3 days of cardiac monitoring. Nothing dramatic, my cardiologist's words, just the kind of precautionary follow-up that becomes routine when you are a man of 65 with a history of skipped beats and stubborn pride. I had my overnight bag on my shoulder and a small paper bag of new prescriptions in my hand. The bus let me off on the corner of Maple and Crescent at 8:47 in the evening. I remember the time because I checked my watch under the streetlight, thinking Dorothy would have dinner on the stove. Then I remembered Dorothy had been gone for 5 years. I still did that sometimes. Checked the time and thought of dinner. Grief is a circuit that never fully disconnects. The night air in Glendale in December has a particular quality, dry and cold, and faintly smoky from fireplaces up in the hills. Christmas lights blinked along both sides of Maple Street. My neighbor across the road had put up an inflatable Santa that leaned slightly to the left, the same way it had for 3 years, and I had always meant to say something. I walked the familiar path up my front steps, the concrete path I had repaired myself in the summer of 2009, and I reached into my jacket pocket for my house key. The key went into the lock and stopped. I pulled it out and looked at it. Same key I had carried for 22 years. I tried again, slower this time, the way you try a second time even when you already know. The key turned a 1/4 inch and refused to go further. I leaned closer and looked at the lock itself under the porch light. It was new. Not new as in recently cleaned, new as in replaced. A digital keypad lock, brushed silver, the kind with a backlit number pad and a small indicator light that glowed red. I put my fingertip against the edge of the installation plate and pressed. The sealant around it was bone dry, fully cured. As a man who had spent decades working with materials and their cure times, I could tell immediately this had been installed at least 48 hours ago. Minimum. I had left for the hospital on Saturday morning. This lock had been put on before I walked out my own front door. My chest did something complicated then, and it had nothing to do with my heart condition. I pressed the doorbell and listened to it ring inside the house I had lived in for 40 years. Footsteps. Then the door opened, 4 inches, stopped by the interior chain. Brandon looked at me through the gap. My son. 38 years old, with Dorothy's jawline and my stubborn mouth, wearing a fleece vest I had given him 2 Christmases ago. He looked at me the way you look at a stranger who has rung the wrong doorbell, not angry, not guilty, just vaguely inconvenienced. "Dad," he said, "you're back." "The key doesn't work," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. 35 years of working on job sites had trained a certain steadiness into me, the kind that stays in your voice even when your hands want to shake. "There's a new lock." Brandon shifted his weight. Behind him down the hallway, I could hear the television in the living room. The warm smell of the house wood and old carpet and something Sasha had been cooking came through the 4-inch gap like a memory I wasn't allowed to enter. "Yeah," Brandon said. "We need to talk about that." "We can talk about it better if you take the chain off," I said. He didn't take the chain off. Instead, he pulled a breath in through his nose and let it out slowly, the way he had done since he was a boy, when he was preparing to say something he knew I wouldn't want to hear. "Sasha is pregnant," he said. I felt something warm move through me, a reflex, something that lived below thought. A grandchild. Then I watched Brandon's face, and the warmth turned into something else entirely. "She's not comfortable having you in the house anymore, Dad." His voice had gone flat and practiced, like a speech he had rehearsed, until the feeling was gone. "She needs space. She needs the extra room. We've been talking about this for a while, and look, your stuff is in the bag by the rail. Everything's in there. We just think it's better this way." I turned slowly and looked at the porch railing. One black trash bag knotted at the top, leaning against the rail. One. I had lived in this house for 4 decades. I had raised a son in it. I had buried a wife and come home to it. And everything that mattered apparently fit in one black trash bag. My throat tightened so hard I thought for a moment I might actually lose my composure right there on my own front porch. My eyes burned. I pressed my back teeth together and breathed through my nose, and I did not let myself come apart, not yet, not in front of the chain on that door. "Brandon," I said, and my voice cracked on the second syllable. I cleared my throat. "It's December. Where exactly do you think I should go?" "There are options," he said. "Hotels. You've got your retirement account. We can figure out the logistics later. But tonight, I paid the mortgage on this house for 31 years, I said, and now something hot was rising in me, pressing behind my sternum. I put the wiring in this house myself. I built the deck off the back. I put that doorbell in that you just let ring. Dad, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." The door clicked shut. The chain dropped back into its slot with a soft, metallic sound. And then I heard Brandon's footsteps retreating down the hallway, back toward the television, back toward Sasha, and the warm dinner smell, and the life that had apparently been reconfigured without me. I stood on the porch, and my legs felt suddenly unreliable, like the ground had shifted an inch to the left. I pressed my hand against the doorframe, solid, painted white. I had painted it myself in 2017. And I breathed. Then I looked down at the trash bag. I crouched and untied the knot. A few shirts folded badly. 2 pairs of trousers. My good dress shoes wrapped in a plastic bag. And at the bottom, she nestled against a pair of work socks, Dorothy's tin box. The old one with the rooster painted on the lid, the one she kept her recipe cards, in the one that had sat on the kitchen counter since 1986. Brandon had packed it without opening it. I knew that because if he had opened it, he would have looked at the recipe cards, decided they were worthless, and left the box behind. He had grabbed it because it was small, and it was mine or mine by association, and he hadn't bothered to check what was inside. I held the tin box against my chest with both arms, and my eyes burned so badly I had to squeeze them shut for a moment. I stood there on the porch I had built in front of the door I had hung, holding a tin box that smelled faintly of cinnamon and decades. And I heard Dorothy's voice as clearly as if she were standing behind me. She had said it 3 months before she died one evening, when I was up on a stepladder fixing the ceiling fan in the kitchen. She had been sitting at the table watching me work, and out of nowhere, in that quiet, careful voice she used when she was saying something important, she had said, "Walt, if they ever come for the house, don't fight them at the front door." I had laughed. I had told her nobody was coming for anything. I had told her she worried too much. I retied the trash bag, picked it up, tucked the tin box under my arm, and walked down the porch steps into the December night. Brand Boulevard. At 9 in the evening in December is not a cruel street. It is just indifferent. The way cities are indifferent. The lights stay on whether you are celebrating or bleeding, and the traffic moves around you, the same either way. I walked north with the trash bag in my right hand, and Dorothy's tin box tucked under my left arm, and the cold worked its way through my jacket in that steady, methodical way that cold does when it has all night and nowhere else to be. 18 degrees Fahrenheit. I found out later that was the temperature that night, the coldest Glendale December in 11 years, according to the news. At the time, I just knew it was the kind of cold that makes your back teeth ache and turns your exhaled breath into small, frantic clouds that dissolve before they get anywhere. I walked 4 blocks before I let myself feel anything. Then it hit me like a downed power line, sudden, total, and violent. My chest caved in on itself, and a sound came out of me that I am not proud of, a low, broken sound that I cut off immediately because I was on a public sidewalk, and I was 65 years old, and I was not going to come apart on Brand Boulevard. But my eyes, God, my eyes burned so badly that the Christmas lights on the houses blurred into long smears of red and green, and I had to stop walking and press the back of my wrist against my face and breathe until the burning passed. 40 years. I had given that house 40 years. I started walking again. Pete Garland's house was on Crescent, 4 houses down from the corner, a tan stucco California bungalow with a covered porch and a flag bracket by the front door, where he flew the Stars and Stripes every morning from 6 to sundown. I had lived near Pete for 30 years. We had weathered 3 recessions, 2 earthquakes, 1 wildfire, evacuation, and the collective grief of losing people. We loved his wife Margaret in 2016, Dorothy in 2019. We did not talk about our feelings. We talked about the Dodgers and local politics, and whether the city was ever going to fix the pothole on Crescent that had been there since the Obama administration. That was how we loved each other, and it had worked just fine for 3 decades. I rang his bell at 9:22. The porch light came on inside of 10 seconds. Pete opened the door, took one look at me, trash bag, tin box, 3 days of hospital pallor, and eyes that I knew were still red, and stepped back from the threshold. "Get in here," he said. Not a question, not an offer. An instruction delivered in the same flat voice he had used for 30 years, the voice of a man who had served 2 tours in Vietnam and come home with the permanent conviction that most problems were best addressed immediately and without ceremony. I got in. His kitchen smelled like coffee and the faint ghost of the chili he must have had for dinner. He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, the same wooden table he and Margaret had bought at a yard sale in 1991, and pointed at it. I sat. He went to the counter and started the coffee maker without asking, because Pete Garland had never once in 30 years asked whether you wanted coffee. You wanted coffee. That was settled. He put a mug in front of me, sat down across the table, and looked at me with those sharp gray eyes that had never quite lost their military precision. "Brandon," he said. One word, not a question either. "He changed the lock," I said. "Sasha's pregnant. He said she's not comfortable." My voice was holding together barely the way old wiring holds together functional until you put any real load on it. There was one bag on the porch. Pete's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. He wrapped both hands around his own mug, and I could see his knuckles go pale, and I knew he was doing what I was doing, keeping the lid on something that badly wanted to come off. "How long was it planned?" Pete asked. "The sealant on the new lock was fully cured," I said. 48 hours minimum. He put that lock on before I left for the hospital Saturday morning." Pete set his mug down on the table with a careful, controlled motion that told me he was furious in the way only a disciplined man can be furious, deep and cold, and very, very still. "I knew something was wrong," he said, his voice dropping low. "Walt, I have to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." I nodded. My throat was too tight for words anyway. Pete pushed back from the table and went down the hallway. I heard him in the back room, the small room off the kitchen that he used as an office, and then he came back carrying a shoebox. Not a new shoebox, an old one, the lid soft at the corners from handling the kind of box a man keeps because it has become a container for things that matter. He set it on the table and lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, a dozen of them taken on a phone printed on regular paper. A black SUV, dark windows, California plates, different angles, different days, and a printout from his security camera, date-stamped footage, stills the camera mounted above his own front door and angled as I now saw directly across to my driveway. "I started noticing that SUV about 6 weeks ago," Pete said, spreading the photos across the table with 2 fingers, the way you lay out evidence. His voice was steady and clipped, the voice of a man giving a report. "Parked in front of your house when you weren't home. Different times of day. I asked Brandon about it once, walked over friendly, said I'd seen the car a few times, just checking. You know what he said to me?" I shook my head. Pete's eyes hardened. He said, and I am quoting him exactly, "It's none of your business, Pete." He tapped the table once with one finger. 30 years I have lived next to you. Brandon grew up calling me Uncle Pete, and he looked me in the eye and said that. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Pete Garland did not crack, so I felt the weight of it. "I've had my camera up since last year when the Hendersons had their truck stolen. I went back and pulled the footage after that conversation." He slid one of the printed stills across to me. Date stamp, December 14th, a Saturday, the day I left for the hospital. A man I did not recognize walking up my front path using a key to open my front door. Tall, maybe 30, dark jacket. Brandon standing on the porch with his arms crossed, watching the street, watching for anyone who might be paying attention. 43 minutes later, the same man walked out. Brandon went in after him, came out again, locked the door. My hands were trembling when I set the photo down. Not from cold. I pressed them flat on the table and stared at them until they stopped. "I don't know who that man is," Pete said, but I wrote down the plate. He reached into the shoebox and pulled out a folded piece of paper, his handwriting neat and small the way military men write. A California license plate number. "I was going to talk to you when you got back from the hospital. Didn't know I'd be doing it like this." I looked at the photo. I looked at the license plate number. I looked at my own hands flat on Pete's kitchen table in the house that smelled like coffee and chili and 30 years of uncomplicated friendship. "Pete," I said, and my voice finally broke just slightly, just at the edges. "I don't want to pull you into something I don't understand yet. I don't know how deep this goes." Pete reached across the table and put his hand over mine, one brief firm grip, the way men of his generation express what they cannot say, and then he pulled back. "Too late," he said simply. "I'm already in it. Now drink your coffee before it gets cold and tell me everything." Pete wanted me to stay. He said it twice, once when I stood up from the table, and once at the front door, his hand on the frame, his jaw set in that way that meant he was fighting the urge to make it an order instead of an offer. "Walt, the couch is right there." "I know," I said, "and I appreciate it more than I can say. But I need to think, Pete. I need to be somewhere nobody knows to look for me tonight." He didn't argue a third time. He was a man who understood the need to go to ground. He pressed the folded paper with the license plate number into my coat pocket and gripped my shoulder once hard enough that I felt it through the jacket. "You call me," he said, his voice rough at the edges. "You call me the second you need anything, day or night. You understand me." My throat closed up on me. I nodded because it was all I could manage, and I walked back out into the 18-degree night before he could see my eyes go wet. I found the warming center by accident. Or maybe not by accident, maybe Dorothy's hand was in it, the way her hand seemed to be in everything I was discovering that week. A paper sign taped inside the dark window of St. Anthony's Parish Hall on Brand Boulevard, hand-lettered in red marker, slightly uneven. "Warming Center open tonight, all welcome, all welcome." Even apparently a 65-year-old retired electrician with a trash bag and a tin box and a chest full of things he didn't know how to say out loud. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at those two words for longer than I should have. All welcome. I had spent 35 years being the man people called when something was broken. I did not know how to be the man who walked through a door because he had nowhere else to go. The cold worked at the back of my neck, and my fingers had gone stiff around the trash bag handle, and still I stood there negotiating with myself like an idiot on a public street. Then I heard Dorothy's voice as clear as if she were standing at my left shoulder. She used to say it every winter when she packed the soup containers into her car for the drive over here. "Walt, it's not intruding. It's just being a neighbor." I crossed the street. I pushed open the door. Inside, the warmth hit me so suddenly that my eyes stung. The parish hall basement held maybe 30 people, men and women on folding cots. A cluster of volunteers in red vests moving between the rows with coffee and blankets. A small Christmas tree sat in the corner with paper ornament chains, the kind children make in Sunday school. Someone's crock pot on a table near the wall sent a thin thread of cinnamon into the air. A volunteer with a clipboard smiled at me, young, maybe 25, the kind of smile that did not contain a single atom of judgment. "Name for the sign-in sheet," she asked. "Walter," I said. "Walter Dillon." "Cot 14 is open, Mr. Dillon, right along the east wall. There's coffee at the back table, and we've got chili tonight if you're hungry." I thanked her. I walked to cot 14 and sat down on the edge of it, the trash bag between my feet and Dorothy's tin box on my lap. The canvas cot creaked under my weight. Above me, taped to the wall, a construction paper angel that some Sunday school class had made slightly lopsided, one wing larger than the other, glitter already flaking off onto the floor below it. I looked around the room at the other people on their cots. An old man with a cough I recognized as bronchitis. A woman about my age with her coat pulled tight staring at the ceiling. A younger man in an army jacket asleep, sitting up, chin to chest, hands folded in his lap, like he had learned to sleep anywhere and had stopped being embarrassed about it. And my chest ached, not with self-pity, but with something I hadn't expected. Recognition. Not one of these people had planned to be here tonight. Not one of them had woken up this morning thinking this was where the day would end. And neither had I. Dorothy used to come here every winter with her soup and her quiet competence, and I used to wait in the car because I told myself I didn't want to intrude. The truth, which I understood now, with a clarity that felt like a slap, was that I had been afraid. Afraid of what it meant to walk through a door like this. Afraid of what it said about the world, that places like this were necessary. I sat on cot 14 and held my wife's tin box against my chest with both arms and let the warmth of the room work its way back into my fingers. And I thought for the first time since I had stood on that porch with my useless key that Dorothy would not be ashamed of me for being here. She would in fact have handed me a cup of soup and told me to stop looking so stricken. The thought made my eyes burn all over again. I pressed the heel of my hand against them hard and breathed through my mouth until the feeling passed. That was when the woman sat down on the cot beside mine. Silver hair and a long braid over one shoulder. Reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. Steady hands. Quick, careful eyes that moved over me with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing situations at a glance. She held 2 paper cups of cocoa and extended one toward me without preamble the way people do when they have been around enough trouble to know that the offer of something warm is always the right first move. "Cold one tonight," she said. "Yes, ma'am," I said. I took the cup because my hands needed something to hold. She looked at me for a moment, not unkindly, not with pity, just with attention, and then she asked in a voice that was almost gentle, "Excuse me, your last name wouldn't happen to be Dillon, would it? I have worked around live electrical current for 35 years. I know what it feels like when something dangerous is close, a particular alertness that moves up the back of your neck before your brain has fully processed the reason. It is not fear exactly. It is attention sharpened to a point. That was what I felt when the woman asked me if my name was Dillon. I looked at her directly for the first time. Silver hair braided over one shoulder, reading glasses on a beaded chain, hands wrapped around her paper cup completely steady, eyes that were moving over me with a quiet, methodical precision that I recognized immediately, not the curiosity of a stranger making conversation, but the focus of someone who had been looking for something specific and had just found it. "Who's asking?" I said. My voice came out flat and careful. She nodded slightly, as if she had expected exactly that response. "My name is Carol Pittman. I was a licensed private investigator in Los Angeles for 31 years. I retired 2 years ago." She paused. "And I have been watching your house from a car parked on Crescent Street since 7 o'clock this evening." The warmth of the room suddenly felt very far away. I set my cocoa down on the floor beside the cot slowly, and I looked at this woman with every bit of attention I had. "You followed me," I said. "I did," she said without apology and without embarrassment. "Your wife asked me to." The word wife landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples went all the way out. "Dorothy," I said. It came out barely above a whisper. Carol's expression shifted, something moved across her face, a softness that had not been there a moment before. "Dorothy hired me in October of 2019, she said. 1 month before she died. She came to my office in Burbank, sat down across from my desk, and told me she needed someone patient. Not fast. Patient." Carol's voice was steady, but I could hear the weight of 5 years in it. "She gave me one job. Watch her husband once a year, know where he is, know that he's safe, and wait for a specific day." My hands had started to shake. I pressed them flat on my thighs and stared at Carol Pittman and tried to hold myself together. "What day?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "She described it exactly," Carol said. "She told me the day will come in winter. You will see him leave his house with one bag and nothing of theirs left in his hands. When that day comes, go to him." Carol reached into the inside pocket of her coat and produced a small photograph worn at the edges, the color slightly faded. She held it out to me. It was Dorothy. Younger, maybe 40, standing in front of a garden I didn't recognize, squinting into the sun and smiling the way she smiled when she didn't know a camera was pointed at her, unguarded, completely herself. My throat closed so completely that I could not have spoken if I tried. I took the photograph with fingers that would not stop trembling, and I looked at my wife's face and something cracked open in the center of my chest, wide and irreparable. She told me things, Carol said quietly, so I could prove to you I was real, so you wouldn't think I was running a con. She held my gaze. She told me your dog's name was Biscuit, Golden Retriever. You got him in '87 and he died of cancer at 9 years old, and you cried in the truck on the way home from the vet and told Dorothy you hadn't cried since your father's funeral. I pressed my lips together hard. My eyes were burning so badly I could barely see. She told me about the scar on your left hand. Carol continued, her voice dropping lower. Electrical accident. 1995. Colorado Boulevard job site. You grabbed a live wire that wasn't supposed to be live, and it threw you back 6 feet, and you got up and finished the shift, because 2 other men's wages depended on the job getting done that day. A sound came out of me then that I am not going to describe. I turned my face away from Carol Pittman and pressed my fist against my mouth, and I shook, not crying, not yet, but something close to it, something that lived just below crying and hurt just as much. She called you Walt the Bolt, Carol said softly. She said you could fix anything with a length of wire and 20 minutes, and that she had spent 40 years being grateful for that, and also occasionally wanting to throw a length of wire at your head. A sound that was almost a laugh came out of me, broken and wet and completely involuntary. I pressed my fist harder against my mouth and breathed through my nose until I could trust my voice again. She never told me, I said, finally turning back to face Carol. Any of this. She never said a word. Carol nodded slowly. She knew you would try to fix it yourself, she said. She said that was the thing she loved most about you, and the thing that scared her most. She said some circuits are too far gone to be repaired from the inside. Carol reached into her coat pocket again, and this time she produced a small key ring, 2 keys on a loop of fabric, red and white, checked the kind Dorothy used to make curtain tiebacks from. She gave me these 5 years ago. She said you would know what they were for. I took the key ring. The fabric was soft from handling. Carol had carried it for 5 years. 2 small brass keys warm from her pocket. My vision blurred completely. I did not try to stop it this time. I let my eyes fill and I held those 2 keys in my palm, and I thought about my wife sitting across from a private investigator's desk in Burbank, with 1 month left to live methodically, arranging the pieces of something she would never get to see finished. Walter, Carol said, and her voice had gone very gentle. Dorothy didn't die of a stroke. The words landed in the hollow space that had opened in my chest and echoed there. She left me a recording, Carol said. She made it herself a few days before she died. I have been carrying it for 5 years. She paused. I think it's time you heard it. Carol drove a silver Honda Accord with a cracked dashboard and a pine air freshener that had long since stopped smelling like anything. We left Glendale at 7:15 in the morning, heading north on the 14, and she did not try to fill the silence with words, which was exactly the right thing to do. I sat with Dorothy's tin box on my lap and watched the city thin out into scrub hills and dry winter grass, and I tried to prepare myself for something I had no framework to prepare for. 45 minutes later, Castaic Lake appeared on the left side of the highway, like a held breath, wide and gray, and perfectly still under the December sky, the surrounding hills pale with frost. Carol took an exit I had never taken, then a smaller road, then a dirt track through a stand of bare sycamores. The cottage sat back from the water behind 2 large maples, small white clapboard gone gray at the corners. Green door, a covered porch with 2 wooden chairs. A firewood stack along the side wall, neatly covered with a blue tarp. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. An old man was waiting on the porch steps, heavy-set tan work jacket, gray hair cut short. He stood when Carol's car pulled up and he held his cap in both hands in front of him. "Mr. Dillon," he said, as I got out. His voice was rough and careful, the voice of someone who had been thinking about what to say for a long time. "I'm Ned Foss. I've been keeping an eye on the place." He paused, working the brim of his cap between his fingers. "Your wife was a fine woman. She talked about you every time I saw her. Said you could fix anything." His eyes went red at the corners, and he looked away fast, blinking hard at the tree line. "I'm real sorry it took something like this to get you up here." My throat locked up entirely. I shook his hand and could not say a single word, and Ned Foss was decent enough not to require one. The brass key turned in the green door like it had been waiting. Inside, the cold had that clean quality of a room that has been honestly kept. Ned had run the heat enough to protect the pipes no more. A thin layer of dust on the windowsills. Dorothy's things exactly where she had left them. The red and white checked tablecloth on the kitchen table. Her recipe box on the shelf above the stove, the same pattern as the tin box Brandon had thrown into my trash bag, because of course it was. A braided rug in front of the sink, worn soft in the center, from years of someone standing there washing dishes and looking out at the lake. Dorothy had stood on that rug. Dorothy had looked out that window. I walked to the sink and stood where she had stood, and looked at Castaic Lake through the glass, and my knees went so weak that I had to grip the edge of the counter with both hands to stay upright. 5 years I had been carrying a story about how my wife died peacefully in our bedroom while I was at work. 5 years that story had been the ground under my feet. And now I was standing in a room she had kept secret from everyone in a life she had been quietly living parallel to ours, and the ground was simply gone. "Walt," Carol's voice behind me gentle. "Take your time." I nodded. I breathed. I let my eyes do what they needed to do, my shoulders shaking once, twice, and then I pulled it back because there was still more to understand, and I needed to be able to think. I turned from the window, and that was when I saw the kitchen table. In the center, placed with deliberate care, a padded envelope with my name on it in Dorothy's handwriting. And beside it, a small black digital voice recorder, its indicator light dark, a single yellow sticky note on top in Dorothy's hand. "Press play when you're ready. Take as long as you need." Before I press play on that recording, before you hear what Dorothy left behind, drop the number 6 in the comments right now so I know you're still with me. Because what comes next changed everything. I thought I knew about the night my wife died. Dad's revenge. Stories exists for moments exactly like this one. Stay close. A note. What follows contains some fictional elements woven in for depth and reflection. If that's not the story you came for, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings. Carol stepped outside without being asked. She simply looked at the recorder on the table, looked at me, and walked out the green door and pulled it shut behind her. I heard her boots on the porch steps, then nothing. I sat down at the kitchen table in Dorothy's chair. I knew it was her chair because it faced the window, because of course she would have sat where she could see the water. And I looked at the recorder for a long time. The play button was worn smooth at the center. Carol had listened to it, probably more than once in 5 years, making sure it still worked, making sure it was still there. The thought of this woman I had met 12 hours ago, sitting alone somewhere, listening to my wife's voice to keep it safe, made my chest hurt in a way I did not have words for. I pressed play, static. Then a breath. Then Dorothy's voice came out of that small black device and hit me like a current through wet hands, total, immediate, and irreversible. "Walt." Just my name. That was all she said for a moment. And in that single syllable I heard her the exact timbre of her, the way she said my name when she meant it, when it wasn't just getting my attention, but was something more than that. My hand flew up and covered my mouth. If you're hearing this, she said, then the day Carol told you about has come. And I'm so sorry, Walt. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you all of this while I was still there to hold your hand through it. A sound tore out of me from somewhere below my ribs. I pressed my hand harder against my mouth and held it there, shaking, while Dorothy's voice continued steady, clear, unhurried, the way she had always been when she was doing something that needed to be done right. She told me about the mortgage, how she had found the paperwork in Brandon's desk while he was at work 6 months before she died. $180,000 borrowed against our house, against the house Walter Dillon had paid into for 30 years with a signature on the documents that was supposed to be mine and was not even close if you knew what you were looking for. She had gone to a notary with a copy. The notary confirmed it in 40 minutes. Forgery, clean and deliberate. She had confronted Brandon. She told me his exact words, which I will not repeat here because they are his to carry, not mine to spread. She told him she was going to the police. 3 days later, Sasha asked Dorothy if she wanted a cup of tea. Dorothy's voice went very quiet at this part. Not frightened, I knew her voice frightened, and this was not that. This was the voice she used when she was being precise. I didn't know at first, she said. I just felt wrong. My heart was racing and my vision went sideways and I thought I was having a panic attack. But I'm a careful woman, Walt. You know that. I checked my pill organizer. The blood pressure tablets were a different shape. Just slightly. Just enough. By the time I understood what I was holding, Walt, I had already taken them with my morning coffee. There was no one left to call who could have gotten there in time. So I did the next best thing. I sat down, and I made sure you would know. I was on my feet without knowing I had stood up. Both hands gripping the back of the chair, knuckles white, the wood creaking under my fingers. I recorded this because I knew I might not have much time, Dorothy said. I've left everything else with Carol and with James Okafor. He's got the trust documents, he's kept them safe. But I needed you to hear this from me, in my voice, because you are going to want to fall apart, Walt, and I need you to wait until after. She paused. I heard her breathe. Don't cry yet, she said softly. Save it for after. Right now, check the bottom of the tin box. James has the rest. And Walt, I love you. I have loved you every single day, even the days you drove me absolutely crazy, which were more than I will mention now, because we don't have the time. The recording ended. I stood in Dorothy's kitchen with my hands death-gripped on the back of her chair, and I stared at the lake through the window, and I did not cry. Not yet. She had asked me not to, and I had spent 40 years doing what Dorothy asked when it mattered, but my legs gave out entirely. I sat back down hard in her chair, put my face in my hands, and shook deep and silent and total for a long time. Then I reached for the tin box. The tin box had belonged to Dorothy's mother. Painted rooster on the lid, red and yellow, the paint cracked at the rooster's tail from 40 years of being opened and closed. Dorothy had kept recipe cards in it her entire adult life. Her mother's handwriting on the oldest ones, faded pencil on index cards gone soft at the corners. Apple butter. Cornbread. The pot roast she made every Sunday from 1984 until the year she got too tired to stand at the stove for 2 hours. I turned it upside down over the kitchen table. The recipe cards fanned out across the checked tablecloth and taped to the inside bottom of the box, sealed in a Ziploc bag, wrapped in a second layer of plastic wrap, a USB drive. Small black the size of my thumbnail. Dorothy had written on the ziplock in permanent marker letters so small and careful, I had to lean in to read them for James. He'll know what to do. I peeled it free and set it on the table. Then I picked up the padded envelope with my name on it and opened it. Two things inside. A key ring. Two brass keys on a loop of red and white checked fabric. The same pattern as the kitchen curtains. The same pattern as the tablecloth under my hands. And a letter 4 pages. Dorothy's handwriting, the good pen she used for things that mattered. I read it standing up because sitting felt wrong, like I would be too comfortable for what was coming. She started with an apology. Not for what she had done, she was clear about that. No apology for the trust, no apology for keeping secrets, but for not being there to explain it in person. I wanted to sit across the table from you and watch your face while I told you, she wrote. I always loved watching your face when you were working something out. You get a line right here. She had drawn a small arrow pointing to nothing, which meant she had been picturing me reading this, picturing exactly where I would be sitting, between your eyebrows. You've had it since you were 30. I never told you because you would have started trying to fix it. My throat seized up so hard I had to stop reading for a moment. She explained the trust. Revocable living trust set up with James Okafor in the spring of 2018 converted automatically to irrevocable upon her death. The cottage at Castaic Lake, purchased in 1979 with money from her Aunt Clara, never in Walter's name, and never in Brandon's deliberately from the beginning, because Dorothy had understood something about the future that Walter had not yet seen. The remaining account balance. Enough to live on, not enough to fight over. I know what you're thinking, she wrote. You're thinking I should have told you, and you're right that I should have. But Walt, if I had told you, you would have tried to talk to Brandon. You would have tried to fix it with a conversation and good intentions. And by the time you understood it couldn't be fixed that way, it would have been too late. I set the letter down flat on the table and pressed both palms against it and breathed through my nose until I could continue. Page 3. Connor, I need you to stop blaming yourself for Connor leaving, she wrote, and my eyes burned immediately hot and sudden. That boy did not leave because of anything you did or didn't do. He left because he saw what Brandon was becoming before either of us wanted to admit it, and he knew that staying would mean choosing a side, and he loved you too much to make you watch him do that. I have talked to him, Walt. He is all right. He is waiting. He will come back when the time is right, and when he does, don't you dare make him feel guilty for the years between. I pressed the back of my wrist against my eyes so hard I saw white. She had been talking to Connor. All those years I thought my younger son had cut us off. Dorothy had been on the phone with him quietly, carefully keeping the thread alive. And she had never said a word to me because she knew I would have what called him. Demanded an explanation. Tried to fix it. She knew me so completely it felt like grief and gratitude at the same time, two currents running through the same wire. The last paragraph was short. She had used a pencil for it, which meant she had written it separately from the rest at a different time. Check the bottom of the box before you go see James. And Walt, you were never the problem. You were always the point. I loved you on purpose every single day, and I would do it again. I folded the letter carefully along its original creases. I put it back in the envelope. I picked up the two brass keys on their loop of red and white fabric and held them in my closed fist until the metal warmed against my palm. Then I opened the door and called for Carol. I'm ready, I said. My voice was wrecked and steady at the same time, the way things are after a storm has gone through and left the air clean. Take me to James Okafor. James Okafor's office was on the second floor of a narrow building on Central Avenue, above a dry cleaner that had been there since the 90s and smelled faintly of steam through the stairwell. The carpet in the hallway was navy blue and worn to gray in the center from years of feet. A brass plate on the door said, Okafor Law Estate Planning and Trust Administration. Below it, in smaller letters, by appointment only. Carol had called ahead. The door was unlocked. James Okafor was 58 years old, a compact man with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of deliberate stillness that comes from spending decades in rooms where people are frightened and grieving and need someone to stay calm on their behalf. He wore a dark green cardigan over a collared shirt, and he stood when we came in, extending his hand across the desk. "Mr. Dillon," he said. His voice was measured and warm. The voice of a man who understood that the words he was about to say had been waiting 5 years to be spoken. "I am very glad you're here. Please sit down." I sat. Carol took the chair beside me. I put the USB drive on the desk between us, and James looked at it for a moment, with an expression I can only describe as relief. "She told me you'd find it," he said quietly. He opened the center drawer of his desk and produced a manila folder thick with documents. "Dorothy came to me in March of 2018. She sat in that exact chair and told me what she suspected was happening with the property. She was calm and she was precise, and she had already done more preliminary research than most clients come in with after hiring an attorney." He paused. "She was a remarkable woman, Mr. Dillon." My jaw tightened. I nodded once because it was all I could manage without my voice going to pieces. James opened the folder and walked us through it methodically, the way a good attorney does. No shortcuts, no assumptions, every piece laid out in order. The Dorothy Dillon Revocable Living Trust, executed March 15, 2018. Under California Probate Code Section 15400, the trust had converted automatically to irrevocable upon Dorothy's death in November 2019. James himself was named successor trustee, meaning he held legal authority to manage and distribute the trust assets according to Dorothy's instructions. The assets the Castaic Lake Cottage purchased outright in 1979, and titled solely in Dorothy's name from the beginning, and an account balance of $31,400, what remained after 5 years of property taxes, homeowner's insurance, and Ned Foss's monthly stipend for maintaining the pipes and the roof. "She said to tell you it wasn't supposed to be a fortune," James said, looking at me over his reading glasses. "She said, and I wrote this down because I wanted to get it exactly right." He glanced at a sticky note clipped to the inside of the folder. "Fortunes bring families. This is enough to be free." The burning started behind my eyes again. I pressed my teeth together and held it back. "There's something else," James said. He set his pen down carefully, the way you set something down when what comes next requires your full attention. "In the spring of 2021, I received a phone call from your son, Brandon. He identified himself, asked whether his mother had left any property or accounts outside of the estate that had gone through probate." James looked at me steadily. I told him I was not at liberty to discuss any matters related to Dorothy Dillon's estate planning. He pushed. I told him the same thing twice more and ended the call. Something cold moved through my chest. Brandon had been looking. 2 years after Dorothy died, he had already been looking. "He knew," I said. My voice came out flat and hard. "He suspected she had something." "He suspected," James agreed. "He couldn't find it because the trust was structured specifically to be invisible to anyone without direct knowledge of it. Dorothy understood that if Brandon found out about the cottage before you were in a position to protect it, he would find a way to get to it first." James folded his hands on the desk. She was right. Carol leaned forward and tapped the USB drive on the desk. The drive has financial records, bank statements, emails, documentation of the forged mortgage, and evidence connecting a third party to Sasha. She looked at James. "We need to know how quickly we can move on the property fraud before the 28th. James picked up the USB drive and turned it over in his fingers. His expression had shifted. The gentle attorney was still there, but underneath it something sharper had surfaced. Something that had been waiting alongside the trust documents for 5 years. Under California Penal Code Section 470, he said, the forged signature on the mortgage instrument is a felony. Under California Welfare and Institutions Code Section 15610.30, what was done to Walter constitutes elder financial abuse given that he is 65, the minimum threshold age. He set the USB down. And because the mortgage went through a federally insured lending institution, we are also looking at 18 United States Code Section 1014, federal loan fraud. That carries up to 30 years. The number sat in the room for a moment. 30 years. Brandon is 38 years old, I said mostly to myself. Yes, James said. He is. He looked at me with the careful, steady eyes of a man delivering a diagnosis he had been dreading and preparing for a long time. Mr. Dillon, your wife built a complete case. Everything we need is either in this folder or on that drive. What we do with it is your decision. But I want you to know. His voice dropped just slightly. She trusted you to make the right one. She said so, in writing. I looked at the folder on the desk. I looked at the USB drive. I looked at my hands in my lap, the left one with the scar from 1995 still white against my palm. Tell me what we need to do, I said. And tell me how much time we have. James picked up his pen. 8 days until the 28th, he said. Let's get to work. James plugged the USB drive into his laptop and turned the screen so all three of us could see it. The folder opened. Dorothy had organized everything with the same methodical precision she brought to her recipe box and her pill organizer, and every other system she had quietly maintained throughout her life. Folders labeled by date, subfolders labeled by category, every file named clearly, so there would be no confusion about what it contained or why it mattered. I leaned forward in my chair and read the folder names, and my hands gripped the armrests so hard the leather creaked. Mortgage forged documents, Meridian Pacific Holdings, bank transfers, debt records, August correspondence, Sasha and Marcus. She knew exactly what she was building. Carol said, her voice low. Open the mortgage folder first, James said. The documents loaded, and James scrolled slowly, giving me time to read. The mortgage application for $180,000 against the house on Maple Street, submitted in January of 2019. Walter Allen Dillon listed as co-borrower. Signature on the bottom of page 4. My signature. Except it was not my signature. I have signed my name approximately 40,000 times in my life. I know the exact way my W leans, the way the loop on the D closes the particular pressure I put on the final N. The signature on that page had the shape of mine, but none of the weight. It was a copy drawn by someone who had studied the original carefully and still could not replicate the thing that makes a signature real, the muscle memory, the unconscious habit, the 40 years of the same hand doing the same thing. They practiced, I said. My voice came out like gravel. They practiced it, and that's still the best they could do. James nodded. An Anderson Forensic Document Services examiner has already been retained. Carol arranged it yesterday. We have a written opinion confirming forgery. That opinion is admissible under California Evidence Code. Carol clicked open the next folder. Bank transfers, a chain of them clean and deliberate. The $180,000 leaving the mortgage account, broken into 3 transfers over 6 weeks, flowing into an account under the name Meridian Pacific Holdings LLC. James pulled up the California Secretary of State Business Registry on a second tab. Meridian Pacific Holdings registered February 2019. Principal officers Brandon R. Dillon and Marcus T. Webb. Marcus Webb, Carol said, and opened the folder marked Sasha and Marcus. The photographs loaded, and I felt something cold and final settle into my chest, the way concrete sets quietly, completely, and without any possibility of being undone. A man in his early 30s, dark hair, the kind of athletic build that comes from a gym membership and youth. Several photographs taken in public places, a coffee shop, a parking structure, what appeared to be a park. In each one, Sasha was with him. And the way they stood together, the way her hand was on his arm in the third photograph, removed all ambiguity about what I was looking at. "The date on that photograph," I said. "What is it?" Carol leaned in. "August 9th. Brandon was in Denver from August 3rd to August 24th, James said quietly. He had clearly already reviewed this. "I have his hotel confirmation from the Marriott downtown Denver." In the folder, Carol pulled it from his business email, which he had linked to the household laptop years ago when he was still working from the kitchen table on weekends. He had never removed it. Dorothy had never mentioned that she knew it was there. I stood up from the chair. I could not sit anymore. I walked to the window and looked down at Central Avenue and pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and breathed. 38 years I had raised that boy. Taught him to ride a bike on the Maple Street sidewalk. Sat with him in the emergency room when he broke his arm at 14. Drove him to his first job interview in my truck because his car had a dead battery and I didn't want him to be late. 38 years, and he had stood outside my house while another man walked in with a key. "Walter," Carol's voice behind me. Not soft, not hard. Steady. The voice of someone who had been in rooms like this before and knew that steadiness was what the moment required. "I need you to stay with me. We have 7 days." I turned from the window. My eyes were burning, but my hands had stopped shaking, replaced by something colder and more useful. The focused stillness that comes when a man runs out of room for anything except the job in front of him. I had felt it once before on that Colorado Boulevard job site in '95 after the current threw me back 6 feet, and I got up off the ground and looked at the panel that still needed finishing. "What's next?" I said. Carol pulled a notepad from her bag. "I've already made contact with Detective Ray Hollis at Glendale PD. He was the investigating officer on Dorothy's death in 2019. He closed the case as natural causes, but he had notes in the file that bothered him. Her medication records didn't match her prescription history from the prior 3 months. He never followed up, and it has been eating at him." She met my eyes. "He wants to meet. He wants to fix it." James leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingertips together. "If Hollis reopens the investigation and requests an exhumation order from the court, a judge will grant it based on the medication discrepancy alone. That gives us 2 tracks running simultaneously, the financial crimes and the criminal investigation into Dorothy's death." The word exhumation landed in my chest like a stone. Dorothy, who had tended her mother's grave every Memorial Day, who had picked out her own plot at Forest Lawn and paid for it in advance because she didn't want me to have to deal with it while I was grieving. The thought of disturbing that, of what it meant, of what it would confirm, I closed my eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. "Do it," I said. "All of it. Both tracks." I picked up the 2 brass keys from the desk where I had set them and closed them in my fist. Dorothy laid this whole circuit out before she died. The least I can do is follow it all the way to the source. James picked up his phone. Carol was already writing. Outside on Central Avenue, a city bus went by with a Christmas advertisement on its side. A family around a table, everyone smiling the world. Outside the advertisement, completely unaware of what was being decided in this second-floor office above a dry cleaner on a Thursday morning in December. 7 days, Carol said without looking up from her notepad. 7 days, I said. Pete opened the door before Carol had finished parking. He must have heard the car on the gravel 30 years in Vietnam, and its aftermath had left him with hearing that still worked better than men half his age and a reflexive awareness of anything approaching his perimeter. He stood in the doorway in his flannel shirt and looked at Carol with the careful, assessing eyes of a man deciding in real time whether someone was trustworthy. Carol looked back at him without flinching. Pete stepped aside. "Come in," he said. "Both of you. I've got coffee on." It was the second time in 3 days he had said those exact words to me, and something about the repetition, the simple, unshakable reliability of Pete Garland and his coffee and his open door made my throat go tight in a way I had not expected. I pressed my lips together and followed Carol inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat 2 nights ago, with my hands shaking and my whole life rearranged. Pete poured 3 mugs without asking preferences. He sat down, looked at Carol, and said, "You're the investigator Dorothy hired." Carol's eyebrows went up slightly. "How did you know?" "Walt told me Dorothy said not to fight them at the front door," Pete said. "Dorothy didn't say things like that without a plan behind them. And Walt didn't end up somewhere safe that first night by accident." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "So, what do you need from me?" Carol glanced at me. I nodded. She told him everything. The recording, the trust, James Okafor, the USB drive, Marcus Webb, the forged mortgage, the 8 days until the 28th. Pete listened with the complete, disciplined stillness of a man trained to absorb information under pressure and process it without visible reaction. His jaw tightened once when Carol described the forged signature. His knuckles went white around his mug when she got to Dorothy's recording. But he did not interrupt, and he did not look away, and when Carol finished, he sat quietly for exactly 5 seconds. Then he stood up and walked to the hallway closet. He came back from the hallway with a shoebox held against his chest, a rubber band around the lid, the kind of container that announces its contents before you open it. Not storage, but evidence. He set it on the table and pulled off the rubber band and lifted the lid. Inside, 12 photographs printed on regular paper, slightly grainy from a phone camera. A black SUV, dark windows, California plates. Different angles, different days, different times of day. Consistent parking location, the curb directly in front of my house on Maple Street. "I started taking these 6 weeks ago," Pete said, spreading them across the table with 2 deliberate fingers. "The first time I saw that vehicle, I thought nothing of it. The second time, at the same spot, Walter was not home, so I paid attention. The third time, I asked Brandon." His voice dropped to a register I had not heard from him before, quiet and dangerous, the way very still water is dangerous. He told me it was none of my business. 30 years, I said mostly to myself. 30 years. Pete agreed. He reached into the shoebox and produced a folded piece of paper, his handwriting neat and compressed, military small, a California license plate number. I ran it through a contact I have from my MP days. The vehicle is registered to Marcus T. Webb address in Burbank. He slid the paper to Carol, who was already writing. And there's more. He got up again. This time he went to the small room off the kitchen, what he called his office, but was really just a desk, a filing cabinet, and a television. He watched the news on and came back with a laptop so old it had a sticker from 2011 on the back. He set it on the table and opened it, and I could hear the hard drive spinning up with the particular labored effort of old technology being asked to do one more thing. The security camera footage loaded in a separate application, grainy timestamp in the upper left corner. The camera angle from above Pete's front door, looking diagonally across the street at the approach to my house. December 14th, a Saturday. The day I left for the hospital at 7:40 in the morning. Pete fast-forwarded. 10:03 a.m., A black SUV pulled up to the curb. A man got out, Marcus Webb, younger looking on camera than in Dorothy's photographs, dark jacket moving with the easy confidence of someone who believed he was not being watched. He walked up my front path. He used a key on the new digital lock. My new digital lock. The one Brandon had installed before I left for the hospital. Brandon stepped out from the side of the house where he had been waiting and stood on the porch with his arms crossed, watching the street in both directions. His posture was the posture of a man keeping watch. I had seen that posture once before when Brandon was 16, and I had caught him standing guard outside his friend's car while said friend was doing something he should not have been doing. Some things do not change. 43 minutes later, Marcus came back out. Brandon went in. He was inside for 8 minutes. Then he came out, checked the lock, and drove away in his own car, which had been parked around the corner. They had been in my house together. On the day I was at the hospital learning about my heart, they had been in my house. My hands were pressed flat on Pete's kitchen table, and I was staring at the laptop screen, and there was a sound in my ears, like a high-pitched tone, the kind you hear after something very loud goes off nearby. Pete reached over and closed the laptop gently, the way you close something when the person looking at it has seen enough. "She knew, didn't she?" he said. Not a question. Dorothy knew all of it. "She knew," I said. My voice came out rough and stripped down the way wood looks after you sand it back to the grain. "She built the whole case herself, alone, in the last months of her life." Pete's eyes went red at the corners. He looked down at his coffee mug, and his chest rose and fell, once slow and deliberate. And I knew he was doing what I had been doing for 3 days, holding something enormous at a distance, because letting it fully arrive would mean not being functional, and being functional was what the situation required. "Tell me what I need to do," Pete said. His voice was steady. His eyes, when he looked back up, were clear. "Whatever it is, whatever day, whatever time, I'm there." Carol leaned forward. "We may need you to provide this footage formally to Detective Hollis at Glendale PD, and we may need you present on the 28th. Pete picked up his mug, drank, set it down. "I'll be there," he said simply. Nobody needed to ask. The 5 days between the 20th and Christmas passed, the way difficult things sometimes pass, not quickly, not slowly, but strangely, with a quality of unreality that made each morning feel like waking up inside someone else's life. I stayed at the cottage. Carol came and went. Ned Foss appeared each morning at 8 with a paper bag from the bakery on the highway, corn muffins, sometimes a slice of coffee cake, and sat on the porch for 20 minutes before going back to his own place without requiring conversation. I understood after the 3rd morning that this was his version of keeping watch, and I was grateful for it, in the way you are grateful for things that cost the other person something and are offered anyway. I read Dorothy's recipe cards, all of them in order, the ones in her handwriting and the older ones in her mother's. I found notes in the margins, small pencil annotations she had added over the years. "Too much nutmeg. Walt said so twice." And on the cornbread recipe in fresh ink, recent enough that the pen had pressed hard into the card, "Ned likes this one. Make extra." She had been making extra cornbread for Ned Foss. Up here at the lake, in the life she had been quietly living parallel to ours. She had been making extra cornbread for her neighbor and noting it on the recipe card, the way she noted everything, because Dorothy believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth keeping track of. My eyes burned every time I found one of those notes. I found 11 of them. Christmas morning, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the lake. Castaic was frozen solid, the surface white and opaque in the flat December light. A pair of ducks walked across it near the far shore with the confused dignity of animals whose environment had stopped behaving correctly. I watched them for a long time and felt for the first time in a week something that was not grief or rage or the cold mechanical focus of preparation. Something quieter. Something that might eventually become all right. Then my phone rang. Carol had bought me a prepaid phone on the 20th, simple, no apps, just calls and texts. I had given the number to Pete and James and no one else. So when the screen lit up with a number I did not recognize, I knew immediately what it was. Brandon had found a way to reach me. Or Sasha had. Or someone acting on their behalf. I let it ring 3 times. Then I answered. Dad. Brandon's voice came through the speaker and hit me somewhere below the ribs, not because it was threatening, but because it was familiar. 38 years of that voice. I had heard it say his first word, which was light because I had been an electrician, and I had pointed at things and named them, and apparently light was the one that stuck. I had heard it break at 14. I had heard it the morning Dorothy died, cracking and genuine. And I had held on to that, the genuine grief of that morning, as evidence that my son was still in there somewhere underneath whatever Sasha and ambition and bad choices had built on top of him. Brandon, I said. I kept my voice completely level, a thermostat set to neutral. I've been trying to reach you, he said. Your old number isn't working. I got a new phone, I said. Which was true. A pause. Then in a voice that had been carefully constructed to sound warm. Dad, Sasha and I have been talking. We handled everything badly. I know that. You didn't deserve to come home to that, and I'm sorry. Another pause calibrated for sincerity. It's Christmas. Come back for dinner. We want to make this right. Family is family. I closed my eyes for 3 seconds. Family is family. He said it the way people say things they have decided to believe because the alternative requires too much from them. I sat on Dorothy's porch in Dorothy's chair, and I felt the pull of it, the absurd animal pull of wanting your child to mean what he is saying. 38 years of loving Brandon Dillon, and that love did not switch off because of a USB drive and a forged signature. It sat there in my chest like a stone I could not put down, heavy and warm and entirely useless. I wanted to believe him. That is the truth, and I will not dress it up. I wanted to believe him the way you want a diagnosis to be wrong, not because you have any evidence it is wrong, but because the alternative is unbearable and wanting costs nothing. But I had spent 5 days reading Dorothy's handwriting. And Dorothy had known. I took a slow breath of cold lake air, and I asked the question I had been saving since the morning I found the tin box. Brandon, I said, keeping my voice easy and conversational, the voice of a man making small talk on Christmas morning. Did your mother ever mention a place up at Castaic Lake, a little cottage she liked? Silence. Not a natural silence, not the silence of someone searching their memory. A held silence. A silence with a hand pressed over its mouth. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. No, Brandon said. I don't think so. Why? And there it was. Because Brandon Dillon had been to Castaic Lake. He had been 12 years old, and Dorothy had driven him up on a Saturday in July, and they had sat on the dock all afternoon, and he had caught his first bass on a rod I had bought him for his birthday, and he had been so proud that he made Dorothy take 4 photographs because he wanted to show me when I got home from the job. I had those photographs in a box in the garage on Maple Street for 26 years. Or I had until 10 days ago. He remembered. I knew he remembered. And he had just looked me in the eye across 400 miles of cellular signal and told me he did not. He was not calling because he was sorry. He was calling because he had figured out I was still alive and unsupported, and he wanted to know how much I knew. The warmth in his voice was a probe, not an offering. He was taking my temperature. "No reason," I said pleasantly. "Just a thought. Merry Christmas, son." "Dad, wait." "Merry Christmas, Brandon," I said again and ended the call. I sat for a long moment with the phone in my lap and the frozen lake in front of me in the quiet of a December morning that had no idea what was happening inside it. Then I picked up the notepad Carol had left on the porch table, and I wrote down everything I could remember about Brandon, from the year he met Sasha to the morning I found the new lock on my door. Not to prosecute him, not even to understand him, but because Dorothy had taught me to keep track of things that mattered, and I was finally at 65 years old, learning to do what she said. 3 days I wrote at the top of the page, then I underlined it twice. Carol arrived at 7:30 in the morning with a folder under her arm and 2 coffees from the gas station on the highway. She set both on the kitchen table, sat down, and looked at me with the expression she used when the information she was carrying was going to hurt. "Tell me," I said. She opened the folder. The first page was a timeline Carol had built from the USB files and Brandon's business email, the one Dorothy had accessed through the household laptop during the months she had been quietly building her case. Brandon had left for Denver on August 3rd. His hotel confirmation showed checkout on August 24th. 3 weeks, the Marriott downtown corporate rate. Marcus Webb's credit card records obtained through a contact Carol declined to name, and I declined to ask about, showed 3 charges at a Glendale restaurant during that same window. A hotel receipt from a property 15 minutes from our house on Maple Street, and a charge at a florist on Brand Boulevard on August 19th. Sasha's obstetric records obtained legally through a release Carol had arranged through James showed an estimated conception date of August 10th through the 15th. I sat with all of that for a moment. Let the arithmetic do what arithmetic does. "She was going to pass that baby off," I said. My voice came out flat and stripped. "As a Dylan." "Yes," Carol said. She did not dress it up. The burning behind my eyes was fierce and immediate, but it was not grief this time. It was something harder and colder, and I recognized it because I had felt it once before on the morning after Dorothy's funeral, when I had gone back to work because staying in the house was not survivable, and I had needed something to do with my hands. The cold that comes after the hot. The thing that gets the job done. I pressed both palms flat on the table. "What about Hollis?" As if she had been waiting for exactly that question, a knock came at the green door. Ray Hollis was 54 years old, medium height, built like a man who had once been an athlete, and still moved like one even though the athletic era was 15 years behind him. He wore a plain dark jacket and held his badge case in his left hand already open the way officers do when they want to establish immediately that they are not there to cause problems. "Mr. Dillon?" His voice was direct and his eyes were steady, and they carried in them something I recognized after a moment as guilt. Not fresh guilt. Old guilt, the kind that has been sitting in a man for years and has shaped itself into something permanent. "I investigated your wife's death in November of 2019. I closed the case as natural causes." He paused. "I had a note in my file that I did not follow up on. Her medication records at the time of death did not match her prescriptions from the prior quarter. I flagged it, and I moved on because the medical examiner's report was clean, and I had 4 other open cases." He looked me in the eye without flinching. "I should not have moved on. I'm sorry." My throat tightened so hard I had to breathe through my nose twice before I could speak. "You're here now," I said finally. It was not forgiveness. It was just true. Hollis sat down. Carol slid the USB drive across the table to him. He looked at the folder, looked at the timeline, looked at the photograph of Marcus Webb dated August 9th. "I'll have the arrest warrant for Brandon signed by a judge before end of day tomorrow," he said. "And I'm filing for an exhumation order this afternoon, a court order allowing us to exhume Dorothy's remains and conduct a second toxicology examination on preserved tissue samples." He said it carefully, watching my face. "It is not a certainty that usable samples remain after 5 years, but the medical examiner's office retains tissue for a minimum of 3 years, and in cases flagged for follow-up." He tapped his own notation in the file copy Carol had provided. "Retention can extend longer. We have a reasonable basis to try." I looked at the window. The lake outside was flat and white and still. Dorothy, who had paid for her own plot at Forest Lawn in advance so I would not have to think about it while I was grieving. Dorothy, who had made my coffee on the last morning of her life and left it in the blue thermos on the counter. "Do it," I said. "Whatever it takes." Hollis nodded once. 2 days, he said. "I'll see you on the 28th. I was awake before 5. I lay on Dorothy's bed in the dark and listened to Castaic Lake doing what frozen lakes do in the early morning, groaning and shifting under its own weight, the ice settling into itself with low, resonant cracks that traveled through the cold air like something alive. I had been sleeping in her room for 10 days, and I still reached for her side of the bed, in the first seconds of waking my hand finding the empty pillow, before my brain caught up with the facts. I dressed in the dark. Navy shirt, the one Dorothy had bought me 3 Christmases ago. Work pants. My good boots, the ones I had worn to every job site meeting in the last decade. Because some mornings you choose what you wear, the way you choose a tool for what the work requires. Carol picked me up at 7. She handed me a coffee through the window before I got in, which was the Carol Pittman version of a long speech, and I took it and said nothing, and we drove south toward Glendale in the early light. We pulled onto Maple Street at 8:20. James Okafor was already there, standing on the sidewalk in his dark overcoat, with his briefcase at his feet, his breath coming in small white clouds. He nodded when he saw me. 2 Glendale PD squad cars were parked at the end of the block, officers waiting unhurried. Hollis stood beside his unmarked car with his jacket open, despite the cold, the way men who have done this many times before stop noticing temperature. A man in a blue vest with a company lanyard, the Vertex Property Group representative, stood at the foot of my driveway with a folder of documents and a confused expression that was rapidly becoming something else as he counted the police vehicles. He made a phone call. Then he made another one. And then Pete Garland walked across the street. Nobody had called Pete. Nobody had needed to. He came in his flannel shirt and his work boots, and he stood next to me on the sidewalk and looked at the house and did not say a single word. I looked at him. He looked at the house. That was enough. I turned and faced the house on Maple Street for the first time in 10 days, 40 years. I had carried groceries through that front door 10,000 times. I had painted that porch in 2003 because Dorothy said the gray was getting tired. I had fixed the gutter after every heavy rain patched the concrete in the driveway, replaced every light switch and outlet and breaker in the panel because I was an electrician, and I would not live in a house with amateur wiring. I had shoveled the walk the one winter it actually snowed in Glendale, which had happened exactly twice, and Dorothy had laughed at me from the window, because I treated 2 inches of California snow with the same seriousness I treated everything else. My throat ached with the particular ache of things that are over, and I know it. I was not angry at the house. I was not angry at anything anymore. What I felt standing on that sidewalk was something quieter and heavier, a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep, the kind that settles into a man when he has been holding something enormous for a long time and can finally see the place where he will be allowed to set it down. A black Mercedes turned onto Maple Street. It came slowly, the way cars come when the driver sees something unexpected and is deciding what it means. It slowed further when Brandon registered the squad cars. I watched the car through the windshield, and I could see him clearly, his hands tightening on the wheel, his head turning towards Sasha in the passenger seat, some rapid calculation happening behind his eyes. The Mercedes stopped at the foot of the driveway, 10 feet from where I was standing. The engine idled for a moment. Then the driver's door opened and Brandon stepped out into the December morning in a blazer and dress shoes that were completely wrong for the temperature. And he looked across the roof of his car at me, and something moved across his face. Not guilt, not yet, but the particular expression of a man whose plan has just made contact with reality. "Dad," he said. His voice was steady. "Give him that." "What is this?" I looked at my son across 10 feet of Maple Street concrete. I looked at him for a long moment, at Dorothy's jawline, at my stubborn mouth, at the 38 years of a life I had tried to build right, and I felt my heart break quietly and completely, the way things break when they have been cracking for a long time, and finally go all the way through. Then I looked at James Okafor and gave him the smallest nod. "Before I take you back to that driveway on December 28th, comment the word Maple below if you're still standing with Walter right now. He has one move left. Dorothy gave it to him 5 years ago, and he has been carrying it ever since. Dad's revenge. Stories, some justice doesn't come fast, but when it comes complete." A note: elements of this story are fictional, added to deepen the message. If this isn't the content for you, this is a natural place to step away, but something tells me you're staying. James Okafor walked forward with the measured pace of a man who had spent 30 years making sure that when he spoke in a difficult room, the room understood he was not going to hurry. He stopped 6 feet from Brandon and opened his briefcase. I watched my son's face in that moment. Brandon had always been good at composure. He had inherited Dorothy's jawline and my stubborn mouth, and somewhere along the way he had developed a third thing, a surface-level steadiness that I had once mistaken for character. He stood on the driveway in his blazer and his wrong weather shoes, and he looked at James Okafor with the careful neutrality of a man who has not yet decided how much trouble he is in. He was about to find out. "Mr. Dillon," James said, and he said it to Brandon, not to me, with the flat professional courtesy of a man delivering information to someone who will not enjoy receiving it. "I am James Okafor, attorney and successor trustee of the Dorothy Ann Dillon Irrevocable Trust. I need to inform you that the sale of the property at this address to Vertex Property Group cannot proceed today or at any future date." Brandon's jaw tightened. The composure flickered just slightly, just at the edges, the way a circuit flickers before it fails. "On what basis?" "On the basis that the mortgage instrument executed in January of 2019, which forms the foundation of the debt that prompted this sale, bears a forged signature." James reached into his briefcase and produced a document, the written opinion from Anderson Forensic Document Services, 3 pages signed and dated, every word of it, the result of Dorothy's planning and 5 years of James holding a locked drawer. "This finding has been certified by a licensed forensic document examiner under California Evidence Code Section 1452. The signature purporting to be Walter Allen Dillon is not Walter Allen Dillon's signature. The mortgage is therefore void. The debt is fraudulent, and the sale contract built on that debt has no legal standing." The Vertex representative had stopped making phone calls. He took 2 steps backward and looked at Brandon with the particular expression of a man rapidly recalculating his entire afternoon, and then his week, and then possibly his career. Brandon's face had gone the color of old concrete. He turned to Sasha in the passenger seat. She was staring through the windshield with both hands in her lap, very still, and I could see from where I stood that her hands were trembling against her thighs. "This is—" Brandon started. "I'm not finished." James said quietly. Not loudly. He did not need to be loud. He put the document back in his briefcase and clicked it shut with a sound that carried in the cold morning air like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Then he stepped aside and he looked at me. This was the moment Dorothy had been building toward for 5 years. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out Carol's phone. She had loaded the file that morning before we left the lake, connected it to a small Bluetooth speaker, the kind you find at any drugstore for $30 palm-sized, a little battered, surprisingly loud for something so small. I had held it in my pocket the entire drive down from Castaic, through the hour of waiting on the sidewalk through James's presentation. It had sat against my ribs like a heartbeat. I walked to the nearest police cruiser and set the speaker on the hood. The metal was cold under my fingers. I looked at the play button on Carol's phone screen. 35 years I had worked with electricity. I knew what it meant to close a circuit the moment the connection is made, and the current moves, and everything the system was built to do finally happens. Dorothy had spent the last months of her life building this circuit. She had laid every wire, labeled every connection, tested every junction. She had trusted me to close it. I pressed play. Dorothy's voice came out of that $30 speaker and into the cold December air on Maple Street, and the world stopped. Not metaphorically. Actually stopped. The Vertex representative froze mid-reach for his phone. Pete's breathing went still beside me. The two uniformed officers who had been murmuring to each other at the end of the driveway went quiet. Even the street seemed to hold itself. Because Dorothy Dillon had been gone for 5 years, and her voice was here now, clear and unhurried, filling the space between the houses and the bare trees, and the Christmas lights still up on Mrs. Carmichael's porch, 3 doors down. I watched Brandon's face when he heard it. I watched the exact moment he recognized her. It was not immediate. For 1/2 second his expression stayed neutral, processing, and then it hit him, and the flinch that moved through his body was involuntary and total, the kind of physical response that bypasses every conscious defense a person has built. His chin dropped a fraction of an inch. His shoulders drew inward. The color left his face in a single wave, draining downward until he looked like a mon standing in rising water who had just understood that it was not going to stop, and there was nowhere left to go. Dorothy spoke clearly. She did not perform emotion for the recording. She never performed anything, which was one of the things that made her extraordinary, and one of the things I had not fully understood until I was standing on a cold driveway, listening to her voice come out of a speaker on a police car. She named the mortgage. She named Meridian Pacific Holdings. She named Brandon, and she named Sasha. She described what she had found, and when she had found it, and what she had done next. Her voice carried in it the absolute calm of a woman who had decided what needed to be said, and was going to say it correctly, regardless of the cost to herself. 3 houses down, Mrs. Carmichael, 70 years old, had known Dorothy for 22 years, had traded recipes with her at the block party in 2015, and sat with her on this very sidewalk. The afternoon the Hendersons' dog got loose had come out onto her porch when she heard the cars. She stood with one hand on her porch railing, still in her housecoat, watching. And when she recognized Dorothy's voice, her face crumpled completely, collapsing inward the way faces do when the grief they are carrying is too large for the muscles to hold. She pressed her free hand over her mouth, and her shoulders began to shake, and she did not try to stop it, and I loved her for that. Pete Garland stood to my left. I could hear him breathing slow and deliberate, the measured breath of a man who had spent 2 tours in Vietnam, learning to keep himself functional under conditions that would undo most people. His hands were closed into fists at his sides, not in anger. In the way you close your hands when you need somewhere to put what you are feeling, so it does not come out wrong. Then Dorothy's voice reached the part about the medication. I had heard this part before alone in the kitchen at Castaic Lake, and I had thought I was prepared for it. I was not. There is a difference between hearing something in private, in a room where you are allowed to fall apart, and hearing it standing on a driveway in the cold, while the woman responsible is 10 feet away from you. Sasha got out of the car. She did not do it dramatically. She simply opened the door and stood up and looked at me across the roof of the Mercedes, and her face held an expression I had never seen before on any human being. Not guilt, because guilt implies a recognition of wrongdoing, and I do not think Sasha had fully arrived at that yet. Not defiance, because defiance requires energy she no longer had. It was a kind of terrible blankness, the look of someone watching the last wall come down and finding nothing behind it to hold on to, no next move, no story left to tell. Just the open air where the plan used to be. Her hands were shaking so badly, she had to grip the car door with both of them to stay upright. "That's not," she started, and her voice cracked on the second word, "Don't." My voice came out low and absolute. It was not a voice I had used before in my life, not with Dorothy, not with my sons, not in 35 years on job sites where men argued about money and deadlines and who was responsible for what. It was the voice of a man who had run completely out of patience for words from people who had already said everything that mattered through their actions. It came from somewhere below my ribs, from the same place that had produced that broken sound in the kitchen 5 days ago, except this version was not broken at all. This version was load-bearing. "Don't." She stopped. Dorothy's voice continued. The speaker sat on the hood of the police cruiser in the December cold, and my wife's voice filled Maple Street, and I stood in front of the house I had spent a lifetime, in the house where Brandon learned to walk, where Dorothy planted tomatoes along the south fence every spring, where I had wired every outlet and replaced every bulb and painted every room at least twice, and I let it play all the way to the end. When the recording finished, the silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my life. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Pete exhaled one long, slow breath that released something he had been holding since the night I showed up at his door, with a trash bag and a tin box. Mrs. Carmichael was crying openly now, not bothering to hide it. The Vertex representative had quietly moved to the sidewalk and appeared to be considering how far he could get before anyone noticed. Brandon had not moved. He stood on his own driveway in his blazer and his wrong-weather shoes, and he looked at me with his mother's eyes and my stubborn mouth and the expression of a 38-year-old man who has just heard his mother's voice explain calmly and completely the thing he did that cannot be undone. I looked back at him. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I owe you honesty after everything. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel the satisfaction I had imagined in darker moments at 3 in the morning that this moment would deliver. What I felt was grief, clean and total and without anger anymore, the grief of a father who has watched something happen to his son and understands now that there was never a version of this story where everyone came out whole. I had loved Brandon for 38 years. That did not stop on a December driveway. It just changed shape into something I did not yet have a name for. Hollis moved first. He stepped forward from where he had been standing, badge already in hand, and he looked at Brandon with the steady, impersonal eyes of a man executing a function that the situation requires, and that he will execute correctly regardless of how it feels. "Brandon Raymond Dillon," he said. His voice was level and clear, each word placed with the precision of someone who understands that what is said in this moment will matter later in a courtroom, in a transcript, in the record of what happened on this street on this morning. "I have a warrant for your arrest." Hollis read Brandon his Miranda rights in a voice that was neither cruel nor gentle, just precise the way legal language is supposed to be delivered, each word placed carefully so that no one present could later claim they had not heard it clearly. Brandon stood with his arms at his sides and listened. His face had gone somewhere past expression, not blank exactly, but emptied the way a room looks after the furniture has been moved out, and the walls show the outlines of where everything used to be. He did not argue. He did not demand a lawyer immediately, which surprised me, and then did not surprise me because Brandon had always believed he could talk his way out of things, and old habits do not release their grip in a single morning. "I want to call my attorney," he said when Hollis finished. "You'll have that opportunity," Hollis said. He nodded to one of the uniformed officers who stepped forward with the handcuffs. I did not watch them put the cuffs on. I turned away and walked to the hood of the Mercedes, and I set the folder down, the one Carol had prepared, the circumstantial evidence on Sasha and Marcus, the hotel receipts and restaurant charges, and the obstetric records with their dates that did not align with Brandon's Denver itinerary. I set it down flat with both hands, the way you set something down when you want the gesture to be understood. Then I looked at Sasha. She was standing beside the open car door, still gripping it with both hands, her knuckles pale and trembling. Her eyes were fixed on the folder on the hood, and her face had the particular quality of someone doing rapid, desperate arithmetic and finding that every calculation comes out the same wrong answer. "That baby is not a Dylan," I said. My voice was low and even and completely without anger, which was the truest thing about it. I was not angry. I was tired down to the marrow in a way I did not think would ever fully leave me. "You know who the father is, and so do the dates." Sasha's mouth opened. For a moment I thought she was going to speak, going to argue, deny, construct one more version of a story that would buy her another day. Then something in her face simply gave way. Not dramatically, not with tears or shouting. Her chin dropped to her chest and her shoulders curved inward, and she made a sound that was small and terrible, the sound of something collapsing that had been holding itself upright through sheer pressure for a very long time. One of the officers guided her gently away from the car. I stood beside the Mercedes on Maple Street, and I put my hand flat on the cold metal of the hood, and I breathed. Pete appeared at my left shoulder the way he always did, simply there. No announcement, no commentary. I could feel the warmth of him standing close in the cold air. "Walt," he said quietly. "I know," I said. People expect a moment like this to feel like something large. Vindication, perhaps. Justice arriving with weight and ceremony. What I felt was none of those things. What I felt was the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a load for a long time in the wrong direction and has finally set it down, not triumphant, just unburdened and not entirely sure yet what unburdened feels like. I looked at the house. The white paint on the porch. The gutter I had reattached after the last heavy rain. The light fixture by the front door that I had replaced in 2015 with an LED unit because Dorothy said the old one made the porch look tired. I had wired that fixture myself. Taken me 20 minutes. Hollis came and stood beside me. "Sasha will be processed separately," he said. "Given the nature of the evidence, the DA's office will likely approach her about a cooperation agreement. She'll have motivation to provide testimony." He paused. "I also filed the exhumation petition this morning. Judge Chen has it. I expect a ruling within the week." I nodded. I could not speak for a moment. "Mr. Dillon." Hollis's voice had lost its professional register just slightly, just at the edges. "Your wife did something extraordinary. What she built, the documentation, the timing, the trust. I have been doing this for 26 years, and I have never seen anything like it." He looked at the house. "She made sure you would be all right." My throat locked up entirely. I pressed my lips together and held it until the worst of it passed. "She always did," I said finally. The squad cars pulled away. The Vertex representative had long since gone. Neighbors drifted back inside. The street became just a street. Again, Maple Glendale, December. A man standing in front of a house that used to be his, with his hand on a car that used to belong to his son. Pete put his hand on my shoulder. One brief, firm grip. "Come on," he said. "I'll drive you back to the lake." "Drive you?" I took one last look at the house on Maple Street. The door was closed. The new lock Brandon had installed was still there, its indicator light blinking red in the morning cold. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I turned my back on it and walked away. The door was locked, I thought. And for the first time since the night he put that lock on, I was glad it was. The morning after was quiet, in the way that only exists after something enormous has passed through. Not peaceful exactly, but emptied the air, still carrying the shape of what had moved through it. I woke at 7, made coffee with Dorothy's navy pot, sat on the porch and watched the lake until the coffee went cold, and then I went inside and did the only thing I knew how to do when my hands needed something honest. I started going through her things, not to sort or discard, just to be with them. To open a drawer and find her reading glasses case and understand that she had set it there and no one had moved it since, and that was somehow enough. I worked through the bedroom first, then the small sitting room. Then late in the morning I came back to the kitchen. The lower left drawer of the kitchen table stuck slightly swollen from moisture, the way wood swells in lake houses. I had to pull it firm with both hands. It came open with the particular resistance of something that had not been disturbed in a long time. Inside was a bundle of papers tied with a length of kitchen twine. Not envelopes, not sealed. Just pages folded once, stacked in order, the twine knotted with the same neat bow Dorothy used on everything. I counted them without meaning to. 19 pages. 19 separate letters written on the yellow legal pad paper she used for grocery lists and thank you notes and everything in between. My name on the first one. Her handwriting. The good pen. I carried the bundle to the kitchen table and sat down and untied the twine and began to read. She had written them across the last 8 months of her life. The dates were in the upper right corner of each one. She had always dated her correspondence, even informal notes, because she said you could never know when it would matter to know exactly when something was said. The first letter was from March. The last was from the morning of November 14th, the day she died. I read them in order. I did not rush, and I did not skip, and I did not look ahead to see how they ended, because Dorothy had written them in sequence, and she had meant them to be read that way. She wrote about mornings, the particular quality of the light on Castaic Lake at 7 a.m. in different seasons, the way the water went silver in October and gold in July. She had been coming up here more frequently. In her last year, she said, not running from anything, just needing a place where the arithmetic stopped. She wrote about Brandon. Not with bitterness which broke my heart more than bitterness would have. With a sorrow that had clearly been sitting in her for years, quiet and private, the way she carried most of the things that hurt her. She had watched something happen to their son, and she had tried to name it and stop it, and in the end she had done what she could from the position she occupied, and no more. She wrote about Connor. I talked to him last Tuesday. He asked about you. I told him you fixed the gutters again. He laughed and said some things never change, and I thought, yes, some things don't. And thank God for that. My eyes burned so badly I had to stop reading for a full minute. I pressed the heels of both hands against them and breathed through my mouth and waited for it to pass. Then I got to the 19th letter. The date in the upper right corner was November 14th. The handwriting was the same as all the others, steady, careful, her good pen. She had not known when she sat down to write it that she would not be alive by evening. Or perhaps she had. Perhaps that was why she had written it at all. Walt, I made your coffee. It's in the blue thermos on the counter. I know you'll grab it on your way out without stopping to eat, because you never stop to eat when you have an early call, and I stopped fighting that 20 years ago. I want you to know that I have loved every ordinary morning, the ones where nothing happened and we didn't say much, and you left for work, and I made the bed, and that was the whole of it. I want you to know that those were enough, more than enough. They were everything. I love you, Walt the Bolt, every single day, even today, Dorothy. I set the letter down on the kitchen table very carefully, the way you set down something irreplaceable, and I stared at it. The blue thermos. I remembered it. Of course I remembered it. November 14th, 2019. I had come downstairs in the dark at 5:45 for a 6 o'clock call across town. The blue thermos had been on the counter, already filled, the lid screwed on tight, the way I always forgot to do it, and she always remembered. I had grabbed it without stopping the way she knew I would, and I had drunk the coffee in the truck on the way across town, and I had thought briefly warmly, the way you think about things you take for granted, that Dorothy was the most thoughtful person I had ever known. I had not gone back upstairs before I left. I had not stopped to say goodbye. I thought she was sleeping. She was not sleeping. She had been sitting at this table, in this chair, in this kitchen, that I had not known existed, writing me a letter I would not find for 5 years. The sound that came out of me then was not something I can adequately describe. It started somewhere beneath my ribs, and it came up through my chest, and it was not crying exactly, though my face was wet. It was something older and larger than crying, something that had been sealed in since the morning. I came home to an empty house and a medical examiner's report, and a son who cried at the funeral and helped me pick out the casseroles people brought. I sat at Dorothy's kitchen table, in Dorothy's kitchen chair, and I let it come. All of it. Every bit of it that I had held at arm's length for 5 years, because there was always something that needed doing, always something that needed fixing, always a reason to be functional instead of finished. I let it come, and I did not try to stop it, and it took a long time. When it was over, I washed my face at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at Castaic Lake and the winter light on the water. And I understood for the first time why Dorothy had bought this place. Not as a refuge, not as an escape, as a place to be fully herself without arithmetic, without management, without the daily labor of holding a family together that did not know it was being held. She had deserved that. She had deserved so much more than she got. I picked up the 19th letter and folded it back along its crease. I tied all 19 back together with the kitchen twine, the same neat bow she used because it seemed important to do it the way she had done it. I carried them to the shelf above the stove and set them next to the tin box. Then I put the kettle on because it was the middle of the afternoon, and I had not eaten since morning, and Dorothy would have had something to say about that. January came in cold and clear, the way California Januaries sometimes do, sharp blue skies, frost on the dock boards in the morning. The lake surface dark and still under the winter light. I had lived by the water for 6 weeks, and I was still not used to the sound of it at night. The occasional deep groan of ice shifting the way the silence out here had a texture that the silence in the city never had. I was getting used to it, though. Slowly. The way you get used to anything that is good for you. Ned Foss came by every morning at 8, with something from the bakery, corn muffins, occasionally a slice of banana bread, once an entire coffee cake that he left on the porch without knocking, because he explained the following morning he hadn't wanted to wake me. I told him I was always awake by 6. He nodded as if filing this information away for future reference, and brought the next offering to the door. I fixed the porch step on the 3rd day of January. It had been groaning under weight for what looked like 2 seasons, the wood soft at the center, the nail pulling loose from the joist. Dorothy's toolbox was in the shed behind the house, a red metal chest with her initials painted on the side in white DAD. Dorothy Ann Dillon, the same initials she had thought were hilarious when she married me. Inside her tools and mine mixed together over decades because we had stopped being able to tell whose was whose sometime around 1992 and had never bothered to sort them out again. I replaced the board in 40 minutes. It was the most useful I had felt in weeks. Pete Garland drove up every Tuesday. He never called ahead. He would pull up in his truck around 9, come around back where I was usually doing something with my hands. Look at what I was doing, and either help or sit on the overturned bucket he had claimed as his and watch. We fished off the dock when the ice was thin enough near the edge. We did not talk much. We had known each other long enough that the talking was optional and the presence was the point. Carol Pittman came on Fridays. She had left a folding chair on the porch in December and never taken it back. On her third visit, I told her she could leave it permanently. She said she already had. James Okafor called on the second Tuesday of January with updates. Sasha had agreed to a cooperation agreement with the DA's office, full testimony about the forged mortgage and the financial fraud in exchange for reduced charges. The federal loan fraud case under 18 United States Code Section 1014 was proceeding separately, assigned to a federal prosecutor in Los Angeles. Brandon had retained an attorney and entered a not guilty plea, which James said was standard, and which would eventually become something else when the full weight of the evidence became apparent to everyone involved. The exhumation order had been granted by Judge Chen. Results pending. I listened to all of it at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee and the lake visible through the window, and I felt nothing but something quieter than I expected. The machine of justice once set in motion requires very little from the person who set it in motion. Dorothy had understood that. She had built something that could run on its own. The 3 a.m. hours were still hard. I would wake and for a few seconds the world would be normal. The cottage, the dark, the sound of the lake, and then memory would arrive like a tide coming in, and I would lie in the dark and let it and wait for morning. I had stopped fighting it. Fighting it was like fighting the ice, pointless and cold, and the ice always won anyway. I wrote to Connor. Not a long letter. Just a note on the yellow legal pad paper, the same kind Dorothy had used, because it was what was in the drawer, and it seemed right. I told him where I was. I told him what had happened. Not all of it, just the shape of it. I told him there was a porch, and a lake, and a toolbox, with both our initials in it, if he ever wanted to come see. I mailed it on a Thursday. The post office in Castaic was smaller than I expected, and the woman behind the counter knew Ned Foss, and asked after him, which was the kind of thing that happened in small places, and which I was beginning to understand was not nothing. 2 weeks passed. Then one evening in early February, I was sitting on the porch with the last of the daylight going pink over the lake when I heard tires on the gravel road. Headlights swept across the porch boards. A car I did not recognize pulled up and stopped, and the engine went quiet. The door opened. A man got out, tall, dark-haired, mid-30s, standing in the headlights, with his hands in his jacket pockets and his shoulders carrying the particular tension of someone who has driven a long way to say something and is no longer certain how to begin. I stood up from my chair. I would know that stance anywhere. I had watched it develop from the time he was 8 years old and had broken something and was trying to decide whether to confess. "Connor," I said. He looked older than I expected. 8 years, does that takes a boy you knew completely and returns him as a man you have to learn again from the beginning. He had Dorothy's eyes. I had forgotten that. Or maybe I had not let myself remember the way you stop looking at certain photographs, because the looking costs too much. We stood in the headlights for a moment, 10 feet of gravel driveway between us, neither of us moving. The February night was cold and still around us, Castic Lake dark and quiet below the tree line, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Then Connor crossed the 10 feet and put his arms around me and held on, and I held on back, and the sound that came out of me was involuntary, and I did not try to stop it. Because 8 years is a long time, and this was my son, and some things do not require dignity. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were red and wet, and he looked at me with an expression I recognized because I had seen it in my own mirror for the past 6 weeks, the face of a person who has been carrying something alone for too long and has just found somewhere to put part of it down. "I should have come sooner," he said. His voice was rough at the edges, scraped thin from the 2-day drive and everything that had been sitting behind it. "I read about Brandon in the news. I got in the car. I didn't know what else to do." "You came," I said. My throat was tight, but my voice held. "That's enough, Connor. That is enough." I made coffee. We sat at Dorothy's kitchen table, the same table where I had read her letters in the cold light of a December morning, where I had found the USB drive under the false bottom of her tin box, where I had pressed my palms flat more times than I could count, and tried to hold myself together through sheer force of habit. Connor wrapped both hands around his mug, the way Pete did, the way I did, and something about the gesture hit me so squarely in the chest that I had to look away for a moment. Dorothy used to say the Dillon men all held their coffee like they were afraid someone would take it. She said it every Sunday morning for years. I had not thought about that in a long time. Connor told me about the calls. Monthly, he said. Dorothy would drive up to the cottage when she knew Brandon had a showing or a meeting. Some reason to be out of the house for a few hours, and she would dial Connor from the kitchen phone here, the old landline she had kept, because she said cell signals were unreliable at the lake, and she was not wrong. They talked for an hour, sometimes longer. She told him about Ned Foss and the corn muffins. She told him about the recipe cards she was going through, the notes she was making in the margins. She told him about the light on the water in October. She told him to stay away until she said it was safe to come back. "She never said it," Connor said. His voice broke on the last word, cracked clean through the way wood cracks when the pressure finally exceeds what the grain can hold. He pressed his fist hard against his mouth, and his shoulders shook once, a single convulsion that he pulled back immediately, the way Dillon men have always pulled things back, imperfectly, visibly, but with the particular determination of people who were raised to keep going. Every month I waited. Every single month I thought maybe this time she'll say, "Come home." And then she was gone, and I couldn't figure out how to. "Connor." I reached across Dorothy's kitchen table and put my hand over his. His knuckles were cold. "She knew, she told me. In the letters." He looked up. His eyes were red and desperate and hungry in the way eyes get when they have been waiting a very long time for a specific thing and it has finally arrived. "She said you left because you saw what was coming," I said. I kept my voice steady because one of us needed to be, and he had used up his steady on the drive down. "She said you were the only one in this family who knew how to get out before it broke you." I paused. "She called it a success, Connor," her exact words. His face crumpled completely. He pressed both hands over his eyes, and the sound that came out of him was the sound of 8 years releasing all at once, ragged and honest, and a long time coming. The sound of a man who has been holding his breath underwater and has finally broken the surface. I sat across my wife's table from my younger son, and I let him cry because it was the right thing, and because Dorothy would have done exactly this, and I was learning slowly and imperfectly, and later than I should have, to do what Dorothy would have done. When it passed, he wiped his face with the back of his hand and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, the bottom of something that had been sealed for years. "She put notes in my lunch bag," he said. Every single day until I was 17. His voice was quieter now, worn smooth by what had just moved through it. I kept them for a while, a shoebox under my bed in Portland. I don't know, I kept moving, and somewhere along the way, she kept hers, I said. Every note you ever wrote back to her. There is a box in the bedroom, the blue one on the top shelf. Connor went very still. His jaw worked. He blinked twice hard and his eyes filled again, but he held it this time, pressing his lips together until the worst of it passed. "Can I read them?" he asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. "They are yours," I said. "They were always yours." We took our coffee out to the porch after that. Dorothy's two chairs side by side facing the lake the way she had arranged them. When she first put them out, angled slightly toward each other. The way you angle chairs when you intend for the people sitting in them to be able to talk. February dark settled around us, and Castaic Lake groaned softly, below the ice shifting in its slow and patient way, the sound of something enormous making small adjustments. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the brass keys. Two of them on the loop of red and white kitchen string, the fabric worn soft, from being carried for 5 years, first in Carol Pittman's pocket, then in mine. I turned them over in my palm in the porch light. Connor watched. He had his mother's eyes, and in the porch light, they were very clear. "Mom left those for you," he said. Not a question. He had figured that out already, the way Dorothy's children always figured things out quietly, without being told slightly ahead of when you expected them to. 5 years ago, I said. She told Carol to give them to me the day I ended up outside my own front door with nothing left in my hands. I looked at the keys. She said I would know what they were for when the time came. Connor was quiet for a moment. The lake groaned again below us, low and resonant, the sound of winter beginning very slowly to let go. "And do you," he asked, "know what they're for?" I looked out at the water. At the far edge of the lake where the shallows met the bank, the ice had begun to thin just barely, just a darkening where the surface had softened, the first visible sign of something that had been happening underneath for weeks. The first sign that the season was changing, that things were quietly and without announcement beginning to move again. "Yeah," I said, "I do now." Spring came to Castaic Lake quietly, the way Dorothy always said good things come. The ice is gone. Connor calls every Sunday. Hollis called in March. He did not need to say much. The toxicology results confirmed what Dorothy had known on the last morning of her life, and what she had made sure the rest of the world would eventually know too. The brass key hangs by the door on its red string. It did its job. Now it is just a house key. I have been telling you this grandpa story tonight because I owe you the truth I learned too late. I spent 65 years fixing everything around me and never once stopped to protect what mattered most. I believe God placed Dorothy in my life not because I deserved her, but because He knew I would need her long after she was gone. This family story cost me everything to learn. So hear me when I say, don't wait. Don't wait to say what matters. Don't walk past the door someone left open for you. Don't be like me, a man who had to lose his home to finally understand what home meant. Any love that sends you a bill is not love. It is rent. The people who truly love you leave the key on a string and never ask for it back. If this grandpa story found you somewhere familiar, drop a comment below, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss another family story from this fire. Thank you for staying until the very end. Some stories here contain fictional elements built for reflection. If that's not your journey, we understand completely. For everyone else, see you in the next one.